Round of applause for Patrick.
Great. Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming along. Really grateful to be here to talk to you today about the signing of Balatro and Abiotic Factor. So yeah, two games that we released in 2024. We're going to talk a little bit about their story and give a kind of very transparent behind the scenes look at what kind of that relationship was like, what the original outreach was like, all the way up to signing the contract. I'm not going to cover absolutely everything in that, but I'm going to talk a little bit about it and show you as much as I possibly can. I've actually kind of split this presentation into two halves. So the first half, I'm going to talk a little bit about Playstack and myself and kind of what we look for when it comes to signing projects, and hopefully that will be useful to people. There's been loads of great talks already today about kind of what publishers are looking for, but hopefully I can give you some specific information about Playstack itself. But yeah, I think I'll start by just talking about Playstack. So that's most of the team, most of the team getting ready for BAFTA, which Balatro is nominated for. We're a London-based indie publisher, but we have an international team, so we have people based all over the world, including North America, Canada, Europe as well. So yeah, we've got 9 years of experience across both mobile and PC console. Our focus these days is specifically on PC console games. We use some of that mobile work a little bit because we port our successful PC console games to mobile eventually if it's the right fit for it. But yeah, we've been around for quite a while at this point, so quite a lot of experience, which is nice. We have proven success across multiple genre spaces. So I'll show you a bit about our portfolio as kind of I go through the slides, but we're genre agnostic at Playstack, so we do consider games in every genre space, and we do like to, cast a wide net as possible. We have an ethos based around publishing a smaller number of quality games, so despite our kind of size and some of the success we've had recently, we're still sticking to about 5 to 6 quality games per year. We don't want to pick up tons and tons of stuff. We feel like we could probably do a good job on 10 games. We want to do an absolutely brilliant job on 5 to 6 games, so that's what we do. And obviously we're focused on long-lasting developer relationships. What publisher isn't trying to strive to do that? But we allow for full creative control in our partnerships, and every dev we worked with since 2019 has continued to work with us in terms of sequels or follow-ups. We know we don't do last or first rights of refusal or anything like that. It's just based on the relationship and people wanting to work with us again, which is really nice. Little introduction about myself. It's really weird to put a picture of myself up on the screen since I'm standing here right now, but that's what I look like sometimes anyway. So I'm the head of discovery at Playstack. It sounds like a really fancy title, but it's not. It basically just means that I lead the scouting team. I do the forecasting, some of the biz dev, developer relationships, dev pitches, pitch deck kind of assessments and all of that sort of thing. So that's what I do within the company. I have 5 years industry experience, so before I joined Playstack about 3 years ago, I was in freelance journalism. That was, kind of where I got my start and moved into kind of the biz dev side of things. So still relatively new to it to an extent, so still learning kind of as I go. So when I first joined Playstack, we just signed Case of the Golden Idol and Entropy Center, so I did work a little bit on those games. Luckily, Playstack gave me a kind of full year to create the scouting process and pipeline. But when I first started, I did some of the English text for Case of the Golden Idol. I did a lot of playtesting for Entropy Center as well. In terms of the projects that I've helped sign for the company, Balatro and Abiotic Factor, which I'm going to talk about today, but I've also signed projects like Lawn Vale, Unbeatable, Darkwater, which released recently, Voidbreaker, which was announced recently, and One Move Away, and plenty of other projects that we haven't announced yet, which is quite exciting. Unfortunately, I'm also the designated Jimbo carrier at every event, so I have to carry that stupid clown with me whenever we go anywhere, but yeah. So what's the point? This image probably shows how I was feeling when I was writing this presentation at the time, but I'm just going to go over kind of some of the things I'm going to cover in this talk. So yeah, I want to kind of start off by talking about what we look for and how we look for it, so just kind of setting that tone before I go into specifically looking at Balatro and Abiotic Factor and kind of what we brought to that relationship, why we wanted to start that relationship to begin with. How do you forecast and predict success? You don't, so I'm going to spoil that right now, but I'm going to go into the forecasting process and kind of what does that process look like, how wrong we are, how right we are, kind of everything in between, try and give as transparent overview as possible. So I'll start by talking about our aim. So this is what we do in the discovery process at Playstack. This is kind of the rules almost that I've set for the team. So our aim is to see every new game, which is a really, really ambitious goal, but we have tools in place to see every new game that comes up on Steam every day, see most of the new games that come across social media. Strong belief in the discovery process and scouting, that a lot of it is based around outreach. Obviously, we do sign inbound pitches and assess inbound pitches, but really it's about scouting, it's about hunting almost for the right project. We want to use an equal mix of analytics data and gut feeling when assessing projects. So I like to think of scouting and discovery as a 50-50 process, 50% head and 50% heart. There are some publishers that do it purely based on vibes or purely based on analytics, and there's a lot of publishers like ourselves who kind of do a mix of the both. You have to love the game. Games are art first, they are an art form, so you've got to recognize that, but obviously you want everyone to be in a good place when it comes to potential sales units and profitability. If it's a relationship that is beneficial for both of you, that's when you sign the project and that's when you work together on it. Focus on games with high ceiling potential. This isn't always true, but usually we look for genre spaces that do have that high ceiling potential, as in they're games that could break out, hit a certain number of units. There are certain genre spaces that are more difficult to work in, and there's always going to be caveats to that because there's always going to be exceptional games. People might say that traditional 2D platformers are a hard space to exist in, but there will be a next Celeste at some point, right? So you've got to keep that in mind with scouting and discovery. You've got to kind of consider all your options. Sign the best games we can with passion and efficiency, which hopefully all of that eventually leads into. So what do we look for when we look for actually signing games? What are the specific things that we look for? Those are some of the games that we've released recently over the past few years. This one isn't super important, but something I always like to mention is aesthetic cohesion and visual quality with a project. And I don't mean visual quality insofar as it's got to have AAA, III graphics, it's got to be really fancy looking, but aesthetic cohesion for the space that you're working in. So is this an aesthetic that works for a Steam audience specifically? That's what we're kind of really focused on. If it looks like a mobile game, that's going to cause issues. And it's also the first thing that players see and that we see on the scouting side as well, is kind of what is the look of this game, what is the feel, what is the aesthetic. And I understand that can be frustrating for devs as well because they might be grey boxing or still working out, but if there is some idea of the aesthetic intention, I think that's a really important thing to cotton on to, just because it is the first visual identifier for the game. Existing within a viable genre space, so something I talked about earlier with traditional 2D platformers, survival craft, things like that. And again, there's always going to be caveats to this. There's always going to be games that create new genre spaces or break out into new fields. That's what I'm going to talk about a little bit in a bit as well, and just kind of explain that a little bit more. Bringing something new to the table or excelling in an existing genre space is really important to us. And developers that are easy to work with. That relationship between publisher and developer is 80% of the battle. Sometimes, if you have a really good transparent relationship where you work really well to each other, that is going to lead on to a great project eventually. So that is something that's really, really important to us, and something that we really strive for, is having that excellent relationship. And to kind of break this down into 4 buckets. So what I kind of do at Playstack with discovery and scouting with the team is try and break these games down, or games we're looking at, into these 4 brackets. And obviously games slip in between the cracks here, and there's always exceptions to the rule. But basically what we're looking for at Playstack is originator and additive games. So what I mean by these is an originator game is something that's doing something completely new. And this can be a bit of a 50-50. So games can be maybe too original in some ways. They're a little bit too out there. They don't necessarily have an audience, but really these are the successful games in a saturated space right now, games that are doing something completely new. And the other problem with originator is you kind of don't know it's originator until post-launch. So I'll show this a little bit later, but when looking at games like Balatro and Abiotic Factor, they were actually forecast as additive games. And then eventually we realized, okay, this is actually an originator. So mostly looking for additive games that have a familiarity to them, but they're doing something new, they're adding something new to the mix, and something that people haven't seen before, essentially. First Cousin Iterative is kind of an odd little space to be in. I always use Vampire Survivors as an example. There are games that came out after Vampire Survivors that were essentially the same concept with a different coat of paint, and those games can be successful, but there's usually a very limited window for them to be successful in. So you've got maybe 6 months post-launch from the originator to find a First Cousin Iterative. Challenging for a publisher, challenging for a developer as well. I usually find that First Cousin Iterative games are best self-published. They're best kind of left to their own devices. A publisher doesn't really need to be involved in that process. And the games that we try to avoid, and maybe avoid's a strong word, but we don't tend to look at iterative games insofar as it's something that everyone's seen before, maybe it's just got a new coat of paint. So those are the kind of, originator additive is what we're kind of striving for as a publisher, and I think most publishers are probably striving for as well. So I'm going to try and put some of that into practice now and talk about signing Balatro and Abiotic Factor and what that looked like, what made us think that they were additive games. But basically how I've kind of done this is I've included screenshots of original kind of intention and original reach out with the devs, just so you can see what kind of the attitude was from our end, how we end up signing games and how that relationship starts to begin with. So Balatro is a video game. I'm glad someone laughed because this joke fell really flat last time I tried it. But yeah, seriously, Balatro is a hyperkinetic poker roguelite deck builder created by the Canadian solo dev Localthunk. I think people really love the game because it's infinitely replayable, it's very sticky, it's got a beautiful aesthetic, but they also love the story around the game as well. That was very important in our marketing, making sure that people knew that this was an organic solo dev game. You know, it came from one person. So yeah, that's what Balatro is. And in terms of finding Balatro, I'm just going to take you behind the scenes a little bit. So Balatro goes up on Steam, May 24th, 2023, and it has 4 followers. So this is quite interesting because I think it's reflective of our attitude at the time, where kind of around this space we were operating quite an old school publishing style, where it's like, well, the more wish lists and the more followers the game has, the more important it is, the more kind of the bigger potential audience it has. And it was interesting that when Balatro went up with 4 followers, it was interesting to us and we did earmark it as something we wanted to reach out to, but it was quite low down on the priority list, launching with 4 followers. We were quite uncertain about it even then. So yeah, it took not too long to reach out to. It's kind of fortunate in retrospect that maybe I was having a slow week or maybe I'd gotten through to a few other people already. But yeah, I reached out on Twitter DMs June 6th, so a little bit after the game went up. I found Localthunk's account and reached out to him directly. He had 0 followers and 0 following at the time, so it was very, very early days. And this is a super small images that you probably can't read from a distance, but just to give you an idea of that kind of original messaging. So my plan at Playstack at the time was we had launched a couple of games at this point, like Golden Idol and The Last Faith, so I could use some of those. I try not to overwhelm developers, especially in Twitter DMs, by sending them a whole bunch of information at once. So I just reached out, let Localthunk know that, you know, the game looks interesting. I highlighted some of the things I really liked about it, you know, the Steam page, how interesting it looked and things like that, and just asked where the best way to play it was. Luckily, he got back to me almost immediately and said he'd send me over an email to kind of give me all the details. So that was a nice kind of like initial reach out. Again, trying to keep it casual, friendly, but also personalized. So we never template anything when we talk to developers at Playstack. You know, it takes that extra bit of time, but it's totally worth it because it shows people that you're invested and you care about the game, which we do. So after that, I got the follow-up email received the same day. Some really interesting things I think to note here initially. So even from day one, I think Localthunk was quite proud of what he created. You know, he says so much himself here. He translates into the game itself. You know, I think the main thing I took from this initial email was that he'd given some thought to joining a publisher, but he wasn't sure. So that's the immediate thing I picked up on. And the thing at this point to realize is, okay, well, this developer isn't sure if he actually wants to work with a publisher. So I'll just be honest and say what we could do if we did work together, but you know, not being pushy, not saying, oh, you've got to work with us, we love the game, we could do this, this, and this. Just being honest, telling him what we could do and seeing if he kind of responded to that. You know, I highlighted as well that he was talking about, you know, difficulty in marketing the game, which I think rang true for a lot of the campaign as well. It is a difficult game to market just from a purely outside perspective, and he didn't enjoy it either. So that was one of the things I kind of focused on in my initial follow-up email. So I sent my response June 7th, so it's all, you know, still pretty close together at this point. And yeah, I was just honest about what we do at Playstack. So here's the services we provide, here's our ethos, here's the number of games we focus on. And then in terms of the marketing, I kind of highlighted trailer creation as the main thing because, at least in my opinion, that's what the Steam page was initially lacking, was kind of really juicy visuals to sell the game. So luckily at that point, we'd had a trailer go quite viral with Axolotl, and we'd worked on Case Golden Idol trailer and the Entropy Center trailers as well. So yeah, just kind of highlighting that to Localthunk, telling him about what we could do on the marketing side. So just, yeah, giving him the information, and again, not being pushy, highlighting again, you know, maybe you don't want to work with a publisher, but here's the things we could possibly help you with if you decided that you wanted to. So here's some initial feedback as well, which I think is relatively interesting. I completed the assessment relatively quickly, so within about a week and a half, got back on June 15th, and this is my initial kind of positive feedback provided. Always interesting to note how wrong you are in some instances, but also, you know, being right to a degree as well. So I was talking about being impressed by all the synergies, the level of variety, difficulty curve not being too punishing, kind of, yeah, all the things that did make the game great. I really love this last sentence where I say I would love to see a few more fleshed out modes, which is just the worst advice in the world. Campaign modes, time attack and things like that. I think the game thrives on kind of its elegance in terms of its mechanical loops and what it offers. So yeah, that's some bad publisher feedback right there. And then just at the bottom there, you know, June 8th, which is when I passed the build through to the team and said I was looking at it. I like to highlight this because I said it has the potential to be a small scale release, which is what we were kind of thinking at the time. And here's the extra bad feedback, which I didn't send directly to Localthunk, but this is kind of the internal feedback that I had for the rest of the team. And again, some of this still sort of rings true and some of it doesn't. But I was talking about how the game will likely have a low RRP because it's, you know, maybe a smaller game. Extremely difficult to market, which I think was, like I said, still the case for a while until it kind of started to take off. And it was very much based around influencer marketing. That was kind of the main goal with Balatro. The current release date at that time was actually set for next month. So it was going to come out super, super quick. He just wanted to get up on Steam and see how it did. And that was kind of one of the main reasons that we came on board with the game, is we could provide funding for an extra 7 to 8 months of work so Local Thug could make the game that he really, really wanted to make. So that was really important. And I also highlighted and I think this is still true, it did have a bad Steam page at the time, which maybe goes to show that why the game didn't launch with, go up on Steam with loads of wish lists or loads of followers. It wasn't until influencers started picking it up and people started playing the game and seeing how the game played that it really started to take off. So one of our goals as a publisher as well to kind of fix the Steam page at that point. And one thing I should mention about that feedback as well, this is when we started to realize that this game could possibly be additive in this space. Looking at the original Steam page, the game did appear to be relatively iterative. It was another roguelike deck builder. Okay, maybe it has a weird kind of poker aesthetic to it, but what does that actually mean for the mechanics? And then as soon as you play the game, that's when you start to kind of formulate, okay, this could be an additive experience in this space. This could be something really interesting. So yeah, signing the game then. Contract was signed in July 2023, so pretty quick. I've called it a not at all stressful 1 month turnaround, which was, I think really good, and you'll see the difference between this and Abiotic Factor when I talk about that a little bit more as well. But yeah, the thing with Balatro was we'd had the time and we'd had a few more games under our belt, and I'd been able to kind of design the discovery process a little bit more so we could act this fast when we had a game that we really wanted to work with a developer on, and we had that kind of initial very positive relationship with Local Thunk. And if you want to read some of it yourself, Local Thunk has created a really excellent blog post where he details the entire development of Balatro. As you can see here, he hires a lawyer to help him with all the contract negotiations, decides to sign with Playstack after speaking with studios that have worked with them in the past, which is really, really nice for us. That's obviously one thing we do with all the devs we work with. We don't give them the email addresses, but we say, hey, find people we've worked with before independently, ask them what it's like to work with us. They'll tell you the good and the bad, and then you can decide if we're kind of the right partner for you. And now we get to the really embarrassing part, which is the forecast. So here's my initial forecast that I wrote up for Balatro. So just to explain this a little bit more, we've got the predicted sales on kind of a low, medium, high, and ceiling. And then we've got the predicted wish lists. So what I do for every game I look at within Discovery is I try and create a genre-specific wish list conversion rate. In the case of a roguelike deck builder, an additive roguelike deck builder, it gets pretty crazy. So I think the initial estimates was, well, this game could potentially, for every wish list, could be worth 13 unit sales if this was a really, really additive original game in this space. I took that all the way down to 1-to-1, which is still pretty ambitious, I think, for kind of sales conversions. And those predicted sales, well, basically the advantage and the disadvantage of forecasting like this is the disadvantage is you are so conservative that sometimes you just don't sign projects. The advantage is these are the sales units that we would have to hit for both parties to be super comfortable, for everything to make sense, for us to get to a good rev share between each other, for everyone to kind of come out well at the end of the day. And those are the kind of games we want to sign. We don't want to sign games where we feel like we can't make a tangible difference to their potential sales. And what I also do kind of when I do the forecasting is I try and plot it against other games in this space. So you can see kind of the Balatro unit sales kind of going up there on those red dots, and the other games I kind of looked at in comparison. So even towards the ceiling for Balatro, we were still under some of the bigger games in the spaces. But again, this kind of conservative forecasting I think is very important and kind of benefits everyone at the end of the day. And then unfortunately we have the reality, which was 5 million units sold pretty quickly within the year. But yeah, I think this is when we started to realize in retrospect that this game was probably an originator in this space and would go on to spawn games that were like it. It would kind of lead the charge in that regard. And obviously, we're delighted with it, but I think it goes to show our initial expectations, calling it a small scale opportunity versus what actually happened with it. And I guess that gave us the confidence as a publisher and gave me the confidence as a scout to continue scouting and publishing games in the same way that we've been doing. So yeah, that's Balatro, which was really interesting experience, but I thought I'd talk about it in comparison with Abiotic Factor as well, which was another game that we released in 2023. So Abiotic Factor is also a video game. That's cool, thanks Dan. But what is Abiotic Factor really? So Abiotic Factor is a Half-Life inspired survival crafting game set in a crumbling science facility. So yeah, this game released in early access. It's going into 1.0 in the next couple of months. But yeah, this was a really beautiful kind of source engine aesthetic inspired game. It looks a lot like Half-Life, but Sven Co-op, System Shock, any kind of games in that vein, but it's also a kind of traditional survival crafting games in a lot of ways, and players have responded really well to it, I think for multiple reasons, because it kind of eschews the normal survival crafting norm, so it's not an open world, it's more kind of like a Dark Souls structured, interconnected world, but with, you know, familiar survival crafting mechanics. So this is a game we actually thought was additive from day one. I'll kind of get on to how this all happened. So finding the game, you know, looking at in comparison to Balatro. So the game went up Monday, 26th of September 2022. So this was quite a little bit before finding and signing Balatro. And it started with 171 followers in comparison to Balatro's 4. So immediately, you know, based on the way we were signing games or based on the way we were looking at data at that time, we thought, great, you know, this is a much more exciting prospect. It's in a much better genre space and it's got immediately a much better response. So this was actually quite a high priority game for me personally from the day it went up on Steam. And so, yeah, just going through some of the initial communication. Sorry again for the quite small images, but hopefully you can read some of it. Reached out pretty much immediately, September 29th, 2022. And yeah, immediately talking to Zag and Henry. And this was a difficult time for scouting and signing games just because we were so much smaller and we really only had Mortal Shell at this point. So this was my only kind of point of comparison to tell devs about what we could do. And I could only talk about the games that we'd announced at that point and not necessarily released. So this also goes to show the difference between signing Balatro and signing Abiotic Factor. Abiotic Factor was a lot more difficult because we just had less experience, we had less proof, essentially, that we were a good publisher that could help with the game. So I received a response within 24 hours from Henry, and immediately this sets kind of the time scale for the communication. While Balatro was so quick, you know, sending emails, you know, daily at this point, you know, Henry was saying, hey, we can chat 18th to the 23rd of October. So within the time span it took to sign Balatro, we wouldn't be able to actually talk to the devs until that point. But yeah, there was a nice initial communication. And one of the things I talked about is creating that personal relationship, especially at this point when we were kind of so small and didn't have that proof that we were a great publisher. It was talking about things like Sven Co-op, you know, we are enthusiasts at Playstack, and it was identifying to devs that, hey, we do know what we're talking about, we do know what this game is about, and we could help with it, we understand the audience. So yeah, the assessment was performed November 7th, 2022. Initial assessment, so I had some written notes for Balatro, but the initial assessment for Abiotic Factor was mostly verbal confirmation between the internal team. So because it's an online survival crafting game, it's 4-player co-op, we're kind of talking to each other, basically, so we didn't really have many written notes for it. I do have an example, though, of what I was kind of communicating to C-suite within Playstack at this time. I like to highlight this because I use a really stupid term, which is GaaS, Games as a Service, which was basically shorthand at this time internally at Playstack for the game will continue to be updated, so like every video game that exists, essentially. But that was the word that was being used to try and get people kind of interested. And again, you know, the difference between this and Balatro, identified Balatro as a small-scale opportunity, identified Abiotic Factor as a medium opportunity, and obviously our kind of attitude to that has changed as data has changed and different things have changed, but that was kind of our thinking that we've kind of grown out of, I guess, a little bit. So yeah, signing Abiotic Factor, the contract was signed June 2023, so compared to the short and stressful 1 month of Balatro, this was a quick and easy 9 months. So yeah, it took a lot longer. I just got a little, you know, feedback there from when we signed the contract and how excited we are for them. So yeah, there was a lot more, I won't say work that went into this, but because the discovery process was still being built, there was a lot of things we were still trying to work out. This involved a lot of presentations to the devs, you know, talking about what we could do, talking about how we do understand online multiplayer games and we can support online multiplayer games. So this is really a proving ground, and kind of Abiotic Factor and that kind of process of signing it really laid the groundwork to be able to sign Balatro, even though we technically signed Abiotic Factor after Balatro. But you know, this entire process was very handy for the discovery team and handy for us as well. So yeah, the forecasts for Abiotic Factor, interesting to compare it to Balatro. So what I've done here is my usual kind of associated wish list and the predicted sales. What you can see here is I definitely did not have a one-to-one for Abiotic Factor in terms of wish list to potential sales. Survival crafting genre is quite, I wouldn't use the word nebulous, but there's a lot of kind of room within it. There is a lot of success, there's a lot of failure, there's lots of different things going on. So instead of a one-to-one, still relatively ambitious, more like a 0.6 or a 0.7 in terms of wish list versus potential unit sales. And what you'll also see is the potential unit sales were a lot higher for Abiotic Factor as well, and that's because again, what we were operating on data-wise at that point was this is a better genre space. This is a more Steam PC-focused genre space. These are the kind of numbers that we're hoping to hit with this game. So again, kind of the low, medium, high, and the ceiling as well. And then usually, as usual, I had my little graph as well where I kind of plotted things out against it. And again, this is the problem with, because Abiotic Factor, we're kind of, looking at it as an additive originator in this space, which is difficult for survival crafting because, one of the problems we had with Abiotic Factor was, well, maybe survival crafting players do just want to hit a tree with an axe all the time. So how are they going to respond to something like this? So much kind of smaller, not as in-depth forecasts, whereas we're trying to figure out if this game was, again, maybe a little bit too original in this space. Maybe this is just not what players want from a survival crafting game. It looks weird, it's not open world, like how is it actually going to react? How are people going to enjoy it? So yeah, that definitely altered the forecasting at this point. But then luckily we have the reality of Abiotic Factor. So luckily it was our second overwhelmingly positive game coming out a month after Balatro did. It sold 600,000 copies in 3 months. So that was within 3 months, and you can kind of do the math to figure out where we are now going into 1.0 in a couple of months, which is really, really exciting. And yeah, we're doing a 1.0 launch across PlayStation and Xbox as well, and it's going to have crossplay. So all that's been really exciting for us, really bolstered us as well, and kind of infused us even further for Balatro and the idea of additive and original games. So yeah, hopefully that was kind of interesting to show what we look for and then putting it into practice a little bit. Yeah, that's kind of covered both of the games that I wanted to talk about in detail. Thank you so much for coming to the talk and listening to me kind of ramble on. Apologies if it was a little all over the place, but kind of cutting here and there to try and make sure it was interesting. But yeah, it was been a interesting journey for us across those 2 games into the future as well. I'm not sure we do have time for questions immediately right now. We need to move on to the next talk. But if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to come and catch me wherever. You can message me on LinkedIn, email me, catch me in person. And yeah, more than happy to talk about any of that and kind of share any data where appropriate. But thank you so much.